The first thing Kevin Aldermack noticed, that August was not the thing itself. It was the screen door. He had installed that door himself in the spring, a 16-gauge aluminum frame he'd ordered from the farm supply in Galesburg, because the old one had warped so badly through winter that it no longer seated flush in the jamb. The new one latched clean, spring tension set tight. Every evening when he came in from the barn, he pulled it shut behind him and felt the click. That click had become part of the routine the way a lot of small mechanical conformations become part of a man's routine when he lives alone on 53 acres and relies on his own hands to keep things ordered. He checked the latch the way he checked the propane gauge and the tractor's hydraulic fluid. It was either right or it was wrong, and if it was wrong, you fixed it. He had been living on the property for 11 years, the last 6 without his father, who had worked the same ground before him. Kevin raised feeder calves and kept a small hay operation. 200 bales cut from the east field most summers. He was 44 years old. He had the build of a man who has carried things his whole life, not wide through the chest, but knotted at the shoulders. Hands that looked like they'd been worked on with coarse file. He didn't tell stories that weren't true, and he didn't tell stories that couldn't be confirmed. His neighbors in Henry County knew this about him. His neighbor Walt Prentice, who ran the property to the north, had once described Kevin to a county extension agent as the most exact man he had ever known. Not a compliment exactly, but Kevin had taken it as one. He had a dog named Gus, a 7-year-old red heeler who had slept on the back porch every summer of his adult life. Gus had never once refused to go outside at night. He would follow Kevin across the backfield in the dark to check the fence line, padding easy at his heel, unbothered by coyotes, unbothered by the territorial dispute the neighbor's German shepherd had pressed against the fence wire for most of 2 summers. Gus was not a nervous dog. He was not the kind of dog that spooked. The first night, Kevin came in from the barn at 8:40 in the evening, and Gus was already at the back door, which was odd because Gus usually followed him from the barn. The heeler was pressed flat against the door frame, not pacing, not barking, just pressed there, with his chin low and his ears laid back and his eyes aimed at the tree line along the drainage ditch, 60 yards behind the house. Kevin stood in the yard and looked where the dog was looking. The cottonwoods along the ditch were dark and still. No wind. The frogs that usually started up along the ditch bank in the hour before full dark were not making any sound. He stood there long enough to confirm the absence was not just a lull. It was complete. The ditch frogs had been going since early June, and they hadn't missed a night that he could recall. He looked at the tree line for another 30 seconds, then went inside. He told himself the frogs had gone quiet because of the heat, which had been unusual that week, upper 90s through Wednesday, and that Gus had come in early because Gus had felt the heat too. He locked the back door and went to bed at 10. He was up at 5:20 the next morning when the light was still gray and the dew was heavy on everything. He made coffee and took his cup to the back porch to check the weather coming in from the west. The screen door was unlatched. He stood with his coffee and looked at the door. The latch was a simple barrel bolt design, the kind you press with a thumb, and it slides home. It had been latched when he went to bed. He was certain of this. The door had not blown open because there had been no wind. He stepped outside and looked at the door frame. No damage, no bent metal, no sign the latch had been forced. He pressed the latch mechanism 3 times to see if it was sticking. It was not. He set his coffee on the porch rail and crouched and looked at the threshold. The aluminum sill had a shallow ridge of dried mud along its outside edge from the previous week's rain. That mud was intact except for one place, near the right side jamb, where something had pressed against it and left a smear roughly 6 inches long, faint and lateral, as if something had leaned into the door from outside. He stood and looked out at the yard. Gus was at his feet, pressed against the back of Kevin's left calf, and he hadn't moved off it since Kevin had come onto the porch. The healer was not growling. He was just there, and his weight against Kevin's leg was steady and deliberate in a way that Gus had never been deliberate before. Kevin looked at the smear in the mud for a long time. He went inside and came back with a ruler and measured it. 6.5 inches. The mark was not a paw print. It was not a hand print. It was a lateral pressure smear, the kind of mark made when something rests its weight against a surface and pushes inward rather than down. He photographed it with his phone. He told himself the door latch might have failed in the night, and the door had swung open in a brief wind he had not felt, and something had come up onto the porch and pressed against the screen. A raccoon, probably. Maybe a large possum. They came up onto the porch sometimes and got into the trash bin he kept near the side step. The trash bin was where he had left it. The lid was undisturbed. The wire he ran through the handle to keep raccoons out was still in place. He went back inside and drank his coffee, and told himself it was a raccoon anyway, and that raccoons could be tidy. He went out to the barn and fed the calves, and by 8 o'clock in the morning felt normal. He didn't like that he had to tell himself it felt normal. That day, he drove to the farm supply in Galesburg and bought a keyed padlock for the back door latch housing. He also bought a motion-activated floodlight, because the back of the house had no exterior lighting at all, and he had never thought to add any. He mounted the floodlight that afternoon on the soffit above the back door. He installed the padlock housing. He tested both. He told his neighbor Walt Prentice about the door latch, not about the smear or the frogs, just about the latch, and Walt said he'd had raccoons get into a soft cooler on his own back deck in June, and that they were getting bolder every year. Kevin said, yeah, probably that. He did not tell Walt about the frogs. The frogs were quiet again that night. He sat on the back porch until 10 o'clock watching the tree line with a headlamp he did not turn on, and Gus sat beside him on the wooden boards and did not go down into the yard. At 9:22 exactly, Kevin heard something in the cottonwoods along the drainage ditch that was not the wind and was not a coyote. It was low, below the range where you think of sound as coming from an animal's throat. It was more like a pressure change. He felt it in his sternum before he identified it as a sound at all. Under that bass note there was something else, a rapid secondary vibration, close to a chitter, but slower, like 2 mechanisms running at different speeds inside one housing. He sat very still for 22 seconds and counted them. Then the sound was gone. Gus was trembling against his thigh. Not shaking the way a cold dog shakes, but vibrating in the musculature, the deep fiber trembling of an animal doing everything possible not to move. Kevin went inside. He locked both locks on the back door. He checked the front door, the side window latches, the cellar access panel in the mudroom. He walked through the house, doing this twice. Then he sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands and made a decision about what he was going to do if the frogs were quiet tomorrow night. They were quiet. He called the Henry County Sheriff's non-emergency line at 8 o'clock on the third evening before going out to the porch. He told the dispatcher he had been hearing something large moving along the drainage ditch behind his property for 3 nights, and had reason to believe it was something other than livestock or coyotes, and he wanted it on record that he had called. The dispatcher asked if he had seen anything. He said not yet. She said she would note the call and that if he observed property damage or had a direct sighting, he should call back. He said he understood. He thanked her and hung up. He sat for a moment and felt the particular quality of that conversation, the way the word yet had made him sound like a man waiting for something he could not explain, and he understood why she had moved on to the next call. He went out to the porch at 8:30. The floodlight had a sensitivity adjustment, and he had it set to trigger on anything larger than a rabbit at 60 feet. Nothing had triggered it the previous night. The motion sensor's area covered the yard from the back step to roughly 40 feet, which did not reach the tree line by 20 yards. He had noted this gap in coverage and was working out how to address it. That night at 11:17, the floodlight tripped. Kevin was in the kitchen when it happened. He had the light on above the table and was reading the parts manual for a baler issue he had not yet resolved. And when the flood came on outside the kitchen window, it made the window bright and then dark as his eyes adjusted to the new light source. He went to the back door without turning off the kitchen light and looked through the window beside it. The yard was empty as far as the light reached. Gus was not on the porch. Kevin turned around and found the healer in the kitchen doorway, standing on the linoleum, not crossing into the room. Kevin looked at the dog, and the dog looked back at him, with the white showing at the inner corners of his eyes. Kevin went to the mudroom closet and took his 12-gauge off the rack. He loaded it with buckshot, 4 rounds, pumped 1 into the chamber, and went back to the back door. He stood for a full minute looking through the window. The yard was empty. The light was still on, which meant whatever had tripped, it was either still within the sensor range or had tripped it and departed in the 30 seconds it had taken him to get the gun. He unlocked both locks and stepped onto the back porch and stood in the floodlight with the shotgun at his side. The yard was empty. The cottonwood line was dark. The frogs were not making sound. He stepped into the yard and walked slowly toward the sensor's edge, watching the tree line. At 38 feet from the back step, the floodlight tripped off because he had cleared its range. He stopped in the sudden dark and stood still and let his eyes adjust. The half-moon gave enough light to see the yard, the tree line, the fence. He stood there for 3 minutes. Then he walked the perimeter of the yard and came back to the porch and went inside. In the morning he found the tracks. They were in the mud along the ditch bank, on the far side of the fence line at the property's back edge. 3 prints in a line before the ground hardened and the impression disappeared into the grass. He climbed the fence and crouched over the first one and looked at it for a long time. The print was bipedal in configuration, longer than wide, with a heel impression at the back. But the toe arrangement was not right for a human foot. The outer digits were splayed far beyond a normal spread. The depth of the impression was wrong. The mud was firm enough that Kevin's own boot left only a shallow print when he pressed his heel in beside it for comparison. The impression in the mud was 1.25 inches deep, and his boot barely registered at 3/4. He measured the print with his tape measure. 14.5 inches long, 8 inches wide at the broadest point. He photographed it from 4 angles. He photographed the line of 3 prints together. He looked at the stride length between them. 64 inches, heel to heel. He stood up and looked at the cottonwoods and the open sky above them and thought carefully about what his options were in terms of rational explanation. A large human being with a gait disorder, stilts, a staged hoax, which required him to identify who would do it and why. He lived alone on 53 acres, and his nearest neighbor in the direction of the ditch was Walt Prentice, who was 68 years old and walked with a cane since his hip replacement in January. He stood there until he had exhausted the explanations he was willing to defend. None of them held when he looked at the depth of the impression against the hardness of the surrounding mud. He photographed the prints 3 more times and went back to the house. He called Walt Prentice that afternoon, not about the prints, but working around to the edges of it. He asked Walt if he had seen anything unusual along the ditch line in the past week. Walt was quiet for a moment and then said his 2 Angus heifers had been bunched against the far fence corner every morning for going on 5 days, and that one of them had stopped coming to the feed trough, which was not like her. Kevin asked if Walt had seen anything along the tree line. Walt said no, but that his border collie had been acting strange, not sick, just strange, and that the dog had refused to go past the barn door after dark for the past week. Kevin said he had had some trouble with something along his ditch and was trying to figure out what it was. Walt said he would keep his eyes open. Kevin did not sleep more than 3 hours that night. He was not exactly afraid yet. He was in the state that comes before fear, the state of measuring, of tallying, of running through the checklist and finding the columns don't balance. Fear prefers 1 enemy to 10 unknowns. What he had was unknowns, and the number of them was growing. The 4th night, the screen door moved. He was at the kitchen table at 12:09 a.m., and he heard the back porch latch rattle. The door was locked with the padlock, so it did not open. The rattle was not wind. It was a deliberate pressure from outside, something pressing the door inward against the padlock's resistance, and then releasing, then pressing again. He sat very still and counted the seconds between the first and second contact. 7 seconds. He stood up and took the shotgun from the table where he had been keeping it within reach since the 2nd night. He went to the back door and put his ear close to the door frame and listened. He heard breathing. It was not close breathing, not directly against the screen, but it was there, 5 or 6 feet back from the door, slow and deep and larger in volume than a dog's breathing, larger than any animal he could name, that he had any expectation of finding on a rural property in Henry County, Illinois. Under the breathing, there was the faint, bass undertone he had heard from the porch. Lower now, almost below hearing, felt more than heard. He stood with his ear an inch from the door frame and did not move for what he later judged to be about 90 seconds. Then the breathing stopped. Then the floodlight tripped. He looked through the window and saw nothing in the lit yard. He watched the tree line for 2 minutes. Nothing moved. The light cycled off. He did not go outside. In the morning there was a new mark on the screen door. Not the smear on the aluminum threshold this time. The screen mesh itself, the 16-gauge aluminum screening, had a lateral depression pressed into it about 46 inches off the ground. The mesh was not torn or punctured. It was pressed inward, as if something had rested against it from outside. The depression was roughly 6 inches wide and 2 inches top to bottom. He pressed his palm against the mesh from inside to gauge how much force would be needed to depress it to that degree. More than a man leaning with one hand. Considerably more. He stood on the porch and looked at the depression in the mesh and thought about the height of it off the ground. 46 inches. If whatever had made the mark was standing upright and had pressed its face or the flat of its lower jaw against the screen, that measurement put the creature's head at a height that did not correspond to anything he was going to find in a field guide. He photographed it and went inside and called the Illinois Department of Natural Resources non-emergency line and reported an unidentified large animal intruding on his property and damaging his outbuildings. The woman he spoke to asked if it was a bear. He said no, the tracks were not consistent with bear. She asked if it could be a large dog. He said no. She said she would note the report and that if he had continued activity, he should file an online incident form with more detailed information, including photographs. He said he had photographs. She said he could attach them to the form. He thanked her and hung up. He filed the form that afternoon. He attached 9 photographs. He received an automated response confirming receipt. That was the 5th day. That evening, his sister Carla called him from Davenport, the weekly check-in she had been doing since their father died. Kevin almost told her. He sat at the kitchen table with the phone, and the words were there, organized. And he chose not to say them because he did not have enough to say yet, that she would not immediately convert into worry about his state of mind. And he needed her to not worry about his state of mind right now. He needed to stay clear. He told her the baler was giving him trouble, and she asked about the Southfield hay cutting, and they talked for 20 minutes about normal things. When he hung up, the house felt very large. He set up a trail camera that night. He had one in the barn used for checking calf movement in winter, and he mounted it on the fence post at the back property edge, aimed at the gap in the cottonwoods where the prints had been heaviest. He used a bungee cord and a ratchet strap to secure the housing and set it to trigger on motion with a 2-second delay. He stood back and looked at the mounting angle and adjusted it twice. Then he went inside and locked the house and sat at the kitchen table and waited. At 2:41 a.m., the trail camera triggered. He did not know this until morning. He went out at 5:30 with his coffee and pulled the SD card and brought it inside and plugged it into his laptop. The camera had triggered twice. The first trigger, time-stamped 2:41:09, had produced a single image. The cottonwood tree line at night, lit harshly by the camera's IR flash, and in the lower right corner of the frame, a partial form. Not a complete figure. The camera was angled for the gap in the trees, and what had triggered it had come from the left, out of the camera's primary field. What was visible was a section of lower limb, from roughly the mid-thigh down as far as the camera's frame edge. The limb was covered in fur, dark gray-brown, matted and long over the thigh, but shorter and compressed below the knee. And the foot, if it was a foot, was partially visible at the very bottom of the frame. The digit arrangement was what it was. He looked at it for a long time without changing his expression. Then he scrolled to the second image, time-stamped 2:41:14, 5 seconds after the first. The frame was empty. Whatever it had been was gone in 5 seconds, and the cottonwood line was still. He poured the remaining coffee down the sink because his hands were doing something he did not want to accommodate. He went and stood at the window and looked at the backyard. Then he went back to the laptop and looked at the image again. The limb in the lower right corner of the frame was not consistent with anything he had a name for. The proportions from mid-thigh to visible foot suggested a total leg length of something approaching 5 feet. He measured the cottonwood trunk in the background of the image with a ruler, knowing the actual diameter of that trunk, and used that to calculate approximate scale. Then he stopped doing that and sat back in the chair. He printed both images on the inkjet on the desk in the spare room. He put them in a Ziploc bag. He drove to Walt Prentice's farm at 7:30 in the morning and showed Walt the images without saying anything first, just setting them on Walt's kitchen table and waiting. Walt looked at them for a long time. He put on his reading glasses and looked again. He said he didn't know what that was. Kevin said he didn't know either. Walt asked if the camera was a good one, and Kevin said it was a middle-grade Bushnell, and that he had no reason to think the image was distorted. Walt looked at the pictures again and then up at Kevin and said in a voice that was careful and honest about its own limits, that he did not know what that was and that he did not like not knowing. Kevin drove home and went back to the barn and worked on the baler through the morning. It was something he could fix. He fixed it. That afternoon, he remounted the trail camera at a wider angle, aiming it to capture more of the tree line, and mounted a second camera he borrowed from Walt on the fence post 12 feet to the right of the first. He set both cameras and checked the overlap in their fields. He went inside at 4 o'clock and cooked a meal and ate it at the table and thought through what the parameters of the situation were. The situation was this. Something very large had been moving along the drainage ditch behind his property for at least 5 nights. It was bipedal, in the sense that the prints and the camera image were consistent with upright movement on 2 limbs. It had come to his back door on at least 2 occasions. It had made deliberate contact with the door on 1 occasion, pressing the screen mesh from outside. It had stood close enough to the door for him to hear its breathing through a closed door. It had not attempted to breach the door. It appeared to be nocturnal in its activity, or at minimum, it operated after dark by preference. It had not injured him, had not injured the dog, had not injured the calves. It had done nothing that constituted a direct attack. He was aware that the absence of an attack did not mean the absence of a threat. He was also aware that the situation had escalated by 1 degree each night, and that there was no reason to assume that progression had stopped. Gus had stopped sleeping on the porch. He had not gone past the back door in 4 days. The 6th night was different from the others. At 11:50 p.m., Kevin was at the kitchen table with the shotgun and a cup of coffee he had made at 11 and not drunk. The floodlight tripped at 11:52, then at 11:54, then at 11:57. The intervals were shortening. He watched through the kitchen window. The yard was empty each time the light came on, and the light cycled off in the 45-second interval without anything crossing the yard. Something was triggering the sensor at the outer edge of its range. Kevin noted that the sensor range was 40 feet, and the tree line was 60 yards, and did the math on what that meant. At 12:14 a.m., the floodlight came on and stayed on. That meant the trigger was not at the edge of the sensor range. It was within sensor range, and it was not leaving. Kevin went to the back door and looked through the window. The yard was lit. He could see to the grass at the property's back fence and the cottonwood line behind it. There was nothing in the yard. He looked at the fence line and the tree line and kept looking. Then he saw it. At the tree line, approximately 10 feet back from the fence, in the dark beyond the reach of the floodlight, there were 2 points of amber light at a height that put them well above the fence line. Not 2 separate lights, 2 reflected points. The bilateral arrangement of eyes catching some residual light from the floodlight at range. They were still, the way a man's eyes are still when he is watching something and not reacting to being watched. Not startled. Measuring. He noted the height of the fence line, which was 52 inches. He noted the apparent height of the eye shine above it. He was looking at eye shine at roughly 9.5 to 10 feet off the ground. He stood at the back door and looked at those 2 points of amber light for what felt like a long time, and was probably 45 seconds. Then the floodlight cycled off, and there was nothing but dark. He stood in the dark kitchen for another 2 minutes, and then very slowly, the floodlight came back on, triggered again, and the tree line was empty. He sat down at the kitchen table and put the shotgun across his knees and looked at the clock. It was 12:17 a.m. He thought about calling dispatch again and knew what that call would produce. He thought about calling Walt Prentice and decided he would do that in the morning when he had something new to show him. He thought about calling Carla and did not let that thought develop into any particular shape. He went to his planning in a systematic way. He had a rifle in the closet, a .30-06 with a scope, and he thought about what he would do with it and at what point a situation of unknown threat warranted a decision that could not be undone. He did not reach a conclusion on that. He checked every window in the house, all 8, ground floor and the 2 upstairs. He checked the cellar door hatch in the mudroom and confirmed the slide bolt was engaged. He turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark with the shotgun and waited. At 1:34 a.m., Gus began to growl. The healer was in the kitchen doorway, the same place he had been sitting since 11 o'clock, and the growl was low and continuous, not a warning bark, not directed at anything Kevin could see, aimed at the back door. Kevin stood up and moved to the door and put his ear to the frame and heard nothing. He stayed there for a full 2 minutes. Nothing. Then he heard it. Not breathing this time. The low bass note from the drainage ditch, except it was not from the drainage ditch. It was close. It was on the other side of the door, and under the bass note was the secondary vibration, the rapid oscillating sound under the lower register, and it filled the space around the door frame, and Kevin felt it in the bones of his face and in his back teeth. Not loud, not a roar, just an expression of size. The way a thing communicates mass without any intention of communicating at all. The sound lasted 11 seconds. He counted every one of them. Then it was gone, and the only sound was Gus, who had stopped growling and was making no sound at all, not even breathing that Kevin could hear from across the kitchen. The next morning, Kevin drove into town and bought 2 additional trail cameras and a 12-volt battery spotlight with a beam rating of 4 million candle power that he had seen used by deer spotters and had always considered excessive for any practical purpose he could imagine. He also stopped at the hardware store and bought heavy-gauge U-bolts and steel cable to reinforce the back door's hinge mounting. He drove home and spent the afternoon on these projects. He was calm and exact and methodical. He noted the way his hands were steady when he was working. The steadiness was not the absence of fear. It was what you built on top of fear when the fear had nowhere useful to go. Walt Prentice came over at 2 in the afternoon without calling ahead, which was unusual, and stood in Kevin's driveway and said that the two heifers had broken through the north fence that morning at some point before dawn and were in the east field, standing against each other's flanks, and would not come back to the barn. He said his border collie had been missing since last night. He looked at Kevin steadily when he said this, and Kevin looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Walt said he was going to spend some time checking his own fence line, and Kevin said that seemed like the right thing to do. When Walt left, Kevin stood in the driveway for a while. That evening he set up the 4 trail cameras in a rough perimeter, 2 at the back fence line, 1 at the southeast corner of the barn, and 1 angled at the back porch from the far end of the woodpile. He ran the battery spotlight out to the porch on an extension cord. He did not have a plan that he was fully satisfied with, but he had the materials and the coverage and the discipline to stay awake and to do the next thing when the next thing presented itself. At 8:40 p.m., the frogs started up along the ditch. He stood on the back porch and listened, and they were going strong. A full spring peeper chorus from the ditch bank, and they had been silent for 7 consecutive nights. He stood and listened to them and understood that their absence had been the first signal, and their return was a signal too. He did not know what it signaled. Maybe nothing. Maybe the thing had moved on. Maybe the frogs knew something he couldn't. He stood on the porch with his hands on the spotlight housing and listened to the frogs for a long time. Gus came out onto the porch and sat beside his boot, and after a while the healer lay down with his head on his paws, not pressed against the door frame, just lying down in the ordinary way dogs lie down when they feel something has changed. Kevin stood there and waited. The frogs kept going. The cottonwood line was dark and still and normal. He went inside at 10:15 and sat at the kitchen table and thought about calling Carla. He did not call Carla. He sat at the table until midnight, and then at midnight he went to the back door and unlocked both locks and stepped out onto the porch with the spotlight in his right hand and the shotgun over his left forearm, and he stood in the dark and looked at the yard and the fence line and the tree line beyond it. Everything was still. Everything sounded right. Frogs going, a car on the township road half a mile west, a freight train somewhere south, all the normal sounds of a summer night in Henry County. He was about to go back inside when he heard it. Not from the tree line, from the left side of the house, from the narrow gap between the house and the propane tank, a sound that was not the frogs and was not the train. He turned toward it and raised the spotlight, and put his thumb on the switch, and stood very still and listened. The sound came again. The same bass undertone, quiet, almost intimate. The secondary vibration just barely audible under it. Close. Inside the range of the floodlight, which meant inside 40 feet. He did not turn the floodlight on. He held the spotlight. He heard movement. Not heavy footfalls, not crashing through brush. A weight shifting on the gravel path along the house's foundation. Something distributing itself onto one limb and then the other, the particular rhythm of upright locomotion on gravel. Then it stopped. He could hear the breathing now, the same breathing he had heard through the door frame, except he was outside, and the breathing was on the other side of the propane tank, and there was nothing between them. Kevin Aldermack turned on the spotlight. The beam hit the side of the house, and the propane tank and the gravel path and everything in it, and he saw what he saw in the 2 seconds before the thing moved. Upright, dark gray-brown fur matted and long over the shoulders and flattened over the legs below the knee. Longer arms than proportion allowed, and the arms were at its sides, and the hands, if they were hands, had reach that extended below the mid-thigh. The head was forward on the neck in the way a dog's head sits forward, elongated muzzle, ears up, not flat, and the eyes caught the spotlight and threw back an amber gold that was bright and immediate and fully awake. It was not crouched. It was not running. It was standing at the corner of the propane tank 14 feet from him, and it was looking back. He did not move. It did not move. The light was on it, and it was fully visible for 1 second and then 2, and the amber eyes did not break from his face. Then it moved, not running, not panicking. It stepped backward, one deliberate step and then another. And then it turned in the direction of the tree line with a speed that the body's size should not have allowed, and it was gone into the dark before his eyes could track it. Kevin stood with the spotlight on the empty space where it had been. He did not lower the light for a long time. When he finally went back inside, it was 12:40 a.m., and the frogs had gone quiet again, and Gus was at the back door, pressed against the frame, and Kevin set the spotlight down on the kitchen table next to the shotgun and looked at his hands, which were not shaking. He thought about what he had seen and measured it against what he knew and understood that the measuring was finished. The checklist was closed. He knew what he was dealing with in the only sense that mattered, which was not taxonomic and was not explainable and was not going to become either of those things by any call he could make to any agency that existed. He went to the back door and engaged both locks. Then he went to the mudroom and opened the high closet and took down the .30-06 and the box of ammunition beside it and set them on the kitchen table next to the shotgun. He went upstairs and checked both windows and came back down and checked the cellar hatch bolt and the front door and the side entry. He pulled on his boots and went to the barn and checked the calves and found them bunched at the far wall of the pen, awake, pressed together. He latched the barn door and came back to the house. He sat at the kitchen table and loaded the rifle. He set it across the table beside the shotgun. He poured the cold coffee from the cup he had made at 11 and made new coffee and poured it and sat back down. The floodlight tripped once at 1:18 a.m. and once at 2:37 a.m., and both times the yard was empty when he looked. At 3:09 he heard something at the northwest corner of the house. The sound of weight on the gravel path again, slower now, and he stood up from the table and picked up the rifle and went to the front window and looked out at the yard and the road and the dark tree line of the windbreak along the north fence, and stood there a long time without seeing anything. The sound stopped. He went back to the table. He sat until 4:15. Then he went to the back door and stood with his hand on the padlock and looked through the window at the dark yard and the motion sensor's steady green ready light and the tree line that was black against a sky that hadn't yet decided whether to get lighter. He thought about 14.5 inches in firm mud. He thought about 46 inches and what that height meant. He thought about the amber eyes, 2 seconds with the light full on them, not startled, measuring. He thought about Walt's border collie, and about the calves bunched at the far wall, and about Carla in Davenport, who did not know yet and would need to know. He thought about the rifle on the table and the 600 acres of corn and field and drainage ditch that spread in every direction from his fence line. Dawn bled slowly into the trees and proved nothing at all. He unlocked the padlock and opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch, with the rifle in his hands and the yard in full growing gray. Morning light was quiet and still, and the gravel path along the side of the house held, in the mud at its edge, where the ground softened after the downspout drain, a single clear impression 14.5 inches long, pressed 1.25 inches into the earth, with the outer digits splayed wide. It was fresh. The edges were sharp. It had been made in the hours after the rain had stopped, which meant it had been made after 2 a.m., while he was inside at the table with the guns and the coffee. It had walked the perimeter of the house at 2 in the morning, and he had not known until now. Kevin Aldermack stood on the back porch in the early gray light with the rifle across his forearms and looked at that print, and then looked up at the cottonwood line, and then at the barn, and then at the long, flat fields in every direction that didn't have any cover in them. For the next 300 yards, he looked at the print again. He thought about what came with darkness and what the darkness coming again tonight would bring with it. He thought about the 2 guns on the kitchen table, and the steel cable on the door hinges, and the 4 trail cameras with fresh batteries. He thought about what the next step was and what it would require of him. The print was there, and it was not going to stop being there. He went inside and picked up the phone, and picked up the